Okay, so we're gonna begin by having you log in like you normally would, and this is a little bit of a longer lecture, so it does a couple things. It combines some of the information that we didn't finish last week, and then it gives you basically the final lecture of the unit, and you'll see there's kind of a break point where you'll recognize where the new lecture is beginning. So we're going to call this lesson History of Federalism, and essentially what it's going to do is it's going to walk you through how federalism has sort of evolved over the last 2 centuries, and then it will also kind of give you a little bit of a review and some new information on different types of federalism. So it does sort of 2 main things here. I did post some pieces that you can look through on the eBoard for review. There's another lecture that I posted from a teacher friend that's pretty popular in AP Government that I met at a conference this summer, and he kind of goes through the whole idea of federalism and reviews it all. So it might be helpful just to hear somebody else's voice and take on it. So you can certainly listen and watch that. It's about 28 minutes, and it sort of does the whole chapter in 28 minutes, or the whole unit rather, in 28 minutes. And then there's another link that I put on that portion of the eBoard that you can click, and it does a really good job of giving you some sentence descriptions on the various types of federalism. So we left off last week talking about public opinion and how, there is this relationship and what it looks like at the modern sense. So this is a public opinion poll where they asked the general public who they felt, which area of government they felt, or level of government, should be responsible for the following categories. So food and medical safety, managing the economy, healthcare, conservation of natural resources, elderly care, college funding, reducing poverty, public schools, and then reducing juvenile crime. So what they did is they take this poll and they basically ask people, think of like Family Feud style. Who do you think? Is this a responsibility that the federal government should have, or is it one that state and locals could have? And this is kind of what the results were. So really interesting when you look at it. Food and medical safety, most people would argue, according to this poll, that should be the responsibility of the federal government. But as we know, public safety and welfare is part of the state powers. It's not something that the federal government deals with. Obviously, managing economy, almost everyone says the federal government for that, and that, of course, makes sense. Healthcare, again, something the federal government should be responsible for. Same thing with conservation of natural resources. Same thing with elderly care. Same thing with college funding. Same thing with reducing poverty. And then here we go, public schools come into play, and the numbers start shifting. Reducing juvenile crime, the numbers shift. So there's definitely clear distinctions about what people think is a responsibility of the federal government, and then again, what is a responsibility of the state and local. And of course, these are opinion-based questions, but it does help us to, force to wonder and recognize how these ideas correlate to what, the actual powers of these entities are. And so, really, when we look at these kinds of ideas and we look at these kinds of public opinion polls, it helps us to understand that the reason why federal power, the reason why our government's power is sort of shrinking, and at the same time, the reason why it grows, is really based on what we, the public, think. And so we can see that in periods where there's national emergencies, such as the Great Depression, or in today's more modern sense, the Great Recession, we want the national government to step in and to help, people versus the states to help them kind of recover. And then at the same time, there's times where we feel like the national government has too much power and maybe it's a little bit out of control, and that was, more common during the 70s and the 90s, so during that post-Vietnam era and Great Society era, and that's when something called devolution was called for. So as we're walking through these different periods today, keep in mind that there's definitely reasons for why that at times the federal government's power has grown, why it has shrunk, and most of that has been determined by public opinion. And the reason for that is that we, as you know, through the ideas of popular sovereignty, are the ultimate check on power of the federal government. And most of that is done through, electing people in and out of office. So we want politicians who are going to sort of adhere to what we feel is necessary. So when there are those kind of national emergencies or tragedies, we're going to vote for politicians who vouch to go in and make sure that the problems are solved. And then when we feel like government's kind of getting in the way and they're not really allowing the states to function as independent entities, we're going to make sure that we have people in place who are going to hopefully rein the federal government back in. So here's a little bit of the history of federalism in our country. So we talked about this earlier, and some of this is review, but this is good review for you. So we start as a confederal system after the Revolutionary War, and in our confederal system, or under what we call the Articles of Confederation, the states have more power than the national government. And in fact, we talked about, the national government not even having enough power to keep the country together, and that's that famous picture where they sort of show all of the states. If you look at all of those pillars, right, they're all falling sort of one by one. So, the Confederate system, while in practice, seems to be, something that we all desired and need at the time. We realize that once we put it into play, it doesn't really work. So after that, right, we have the Constitutional Convention, and we create a federal system of government, and we sort of flip-flop it. So we try this confederal system through the Articles of Confederation. That doesn't work. We meet back in Philadelphia in 1787, and what the framers of the Constitution do is create a federal system of government where the national government is going to have more power than the states. And in fact, written down in the Constitution, there will be more powers that the national government gains. So if you did a quick comparison of the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, which would be a really great way to review, you'll see that more things are added, like the Commerce Clause and coining money, etc. But then there's this group of people that we talked about called the Anti-Federalists, who are still very fearful. Remember, they have the king in the back of their mind. They have the experience prior to the Revolution and the Declaration of Independence of the reasons that they wanted to get out of that relationship, and so they don't forget that. It hasn't been so far, it's only been about 20 years, and so they're very fearful still that the national government will eventually take over, and after all, that's been their life experience. That's what they've known following the French and Indian War, Boston Massacre, the Tea Party, the Tea Acts, the Stamp Acts, all of those things. So they push to have a Bill of Rights added, and in that Bill of Rights, they're going to protect certain freedoms for Americans, and those are going to be more individual freedoms, but then they're going to put that 10th Amendment in. And that 10th Amendment is going to basically say that anything not written down in the Constitution that has not been expressed or enumerated, that's not been explicitly stated, is going to be reserved for the states. And so that opens up, essentially, a really, really large realm for where states are going to control certain things. And about this time, you can really say, like, from 1787, this is when dual federalism is going to begin. So last week we did talk about dual federalism. We talked about the federal and the state governments being sort of equal in this sense, where they each have their own sphere of power, and they basically are equal in terms of not how much power they have, but how much power they have over their certain sphere. So the federal government can only do specific things mentioned in the Constitution, and then that leaves the state to have sort of greater role and powers within their own individual state. So everyone kind of keeps to themselves. And we talked about dual federalism being compared to a layer cake. So each layer of the cake, right, is separate, looks different, tastes different than the others, and that's sort of how the state and the governments operate in dual federalism. Everybody's separate, everybody's got their, their own flavor, if you will, and they have their own control and power over their specific territories. So when we talk about the national government, they're controlling policy and area of government relations that affects the whole country. And then when we're talking about states, we're talking about individual policies and governmental relations that affect just the people within that state. Now, along the way, there were lots of things that sort of help to define dual federalism. The first being McCulloch versus Maryland, and that happened in 1819. And that was included in the last lecture. So in McCulloch versus Maryland, remember, we have this Bank of the United States was created. They go to open up a branch in Maryland. That's James McCulloch. He's the one who's going to open up that branch. And the state of Maryland kind of freaks out. And they say, well, I know how we can get rid of this Bank of the United States. We'll tax the crap out of them, so to speak. So they're going to pose, or this whole case is going to pose a couple questions. The first is, can the U.S. make a bank even though it's not specifically mentioned in the Constitution? The second is going to be, can a state tax the federal government? And the answers to both of those questions are going to be, first, yes. Because of implied powers, because of the ability to allow, or because the federal government is allowed to coin money, it is therefore allowed to create a bank, okay, to control the supply of money and things like that. Secondly, no. States cannot tax the federal government because of what we know as the Supremacy Clause, Article 6. The Supremacy Clause always means that the federal governments have more power and more authority, more control, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, not state governments. So McCulloch versus Maryland is really, really helpful in that it helps to sort of define what implied powers are, and it really helps to redefine the idea of supremacy. About 5 years later, another case is brought to trial called Gibbons versus Ogden. And here's basically the gist behind this particular case. There was a New York company, and they gave exclusive rights to sail steamships on New York rivers. Now, one of these New York rivers also bordered New Jersey. So as the steamships were sailing on the rivers, they realized, okay, that once they got into New Jersey, the New Jersey tax rates were extremely high. Well, eventually New Jersey also got pretty frustrated with all of these steamships kind of going through their territory without really having gotten permission. So what happens is New Jersey tries to basically call time out and say, no, you're not allowed to travel here. Well, the two groups sue each other. And what the Supreme Court ends up deciding is that absolutely, okay, this is an idea behind interstate commerce. It is a national power. The national government, okay, encourages business between states, and that the state of New Jersey cannot prevent people and New Yorkers from coming in, and vice versa. New Yorkers can't prevent New Jerseyans from coming in. And so basically the only people that could do that would be the national government because it involves interstate commerce. After all, these steamships were carrying cargo and things like that. So you can see that there's a large, broad interpretation of the Constitution. It gives Supreme Court justices the know-how, if you will, to take what's written down and to kind of interpret it for themselves. And dual federalism does that. That's how it helps to create that separation and that sphere between the federal and the state powers. Then there's the Civil War. And of course, the Civil War was over slavery, but it was also over states' rights. It was the national government trying to tell the states how to basically conduct business, if you will. Slavery was a business, so Commerce Clause is going to come into play. They're also going to talk about things like, the citizenship, and is really the national government permitted to define what citizenship is? So there's the main argument over the Civil War is that the southern states, they're trying to preserve their way of life, and part of their way of life involves slavery because that is the way that they make a living. And the national government, or the union states, okay, they're fighting over sort of the power on who has the say and control in ideas and things like slavery and citizenship. So, obviously the Civil War is this really kind of strange period in American history, and most of us, when we think of it as just a slavery issue, but it's not. It's a commerce issue. It's a cultural issue. It's who has more power. It's really that control for all of those things. And again, the southern states kind of want to preserve their way of life. They're arguing to remain separate in their own sphere, while the national government is kind of really eliciting or supposing, if you will, that slavery, because it involves all these other things like commerce and citizenship, it is truly a national government power. So if you really want to be technical, the Civil War is an argue over the idea of federalism. And then there's the New Deal. You're talking 1939, right before World War II. The Great Depression is, basically ravaging our country. We have almost nobody working. People are extremely poor. They're starving. They can't make ends meet. There's all these things popping up called Hoovervilles. People are homeless. And it's such a large problem that no one state can actually handle it. No one state can provide enough welfare and care and employment opportunities to get their people out of this really terrible rut. So the national government, under the leadership of President FDR, they begin to expand the national government. They create, Social Security. They create a welfare system. They create unemployment insurance. And slowly but surely, they help to kind of get people back on their feet. They create what's called the ABC program. So they're going to create something called the FDIC, which is going to protect your money in your bank. And if you guys, the next time you go to the bank, you'll see there's a sign of the FDIC basically saying your bank is protected by it, so that your money won't just disappear and get lost if the bank, goes bankrupt. The WPA, the Worker Program Association, or Public Works Administration, where they're going to put people in the country to work to build things like schools and public buildings and highways and bridges. They're going to take regular, ordinary people, and they're going to put them to work by bettering the country in the process. And that was sort of the basis for the New Deal. And that's really one of the main ways that FDR felt he could get the country out of the Great Depression. Again, the sphere here starts to become sort of clouded, because no longer is the federal government and the states kind of operating independently. Now it sort of becomes this intermixing. And so the New Deal, really 1939, is when cooperative federalism comes into play. And cooperative federalism is basically the idea that if all levels of government work together, they can solve common problems that exist. So the Great Depression is sort of the first experiment behind cooperative federalism. So what's going to happen is the national and state government are going to share powers and policy assignments. So this basically begins in the Great Depression. It lasts up until the 1970s. And in this time, the national government's going to sort of take control of situations and fix problems like the economy under that idea of the New Deal. But the state governments are going to have to also have a role in doing that. And so they're going to share costs. While there's going to be federal guidelines of how these programs are going to work, they're going to share the costs behind them. And this starts to get a little bit clouded into the reserve powers, because the national government in some areas does sort of step on the state's toes. So there's a little bit less distinction behind who's in charge of what, because everyone's sort of sharing the costs, and they're also sharing administration of it. The state and local officials are going to take those federal guidelines, and they're going to implement policies under their own individual administration. So here's a really good example. If you take something like airport construction. Okay, airport construction is a really great example of cooperative federalism because when people get on airplanes, or even if they don't get on airplanes and you're talking about cargo, meaning like goods, like jeans, okay? If there's a shipment of jeans that's coming from Ohio but is going to get to Pennsylvania, okay? It's going to go through an airport to do that. So when an airport is constructed, it's constructed on state property, not obviously federal property. So, Philadelphia International Airport is an airport in the state of Pennsylvania. However, all the people that fly out of Philadelphia International Airport are going to other places. And when they go to other places, they're going to be spending money. So that, right, that introduces the idea of interstate commerce. Also, products made in Philadelphia will fly in and out of that Philadelphia International Airport. So there's federal guidelines to flying, right? You have to go through security. Planes have to pass certain safety regulations. They can only emit so much pollution, etc., etc. All right. So the cost of building the airport is going to be shared by both the state at the state level or in the city and the federal government. The guidelines behind constructing the airport and the planes that fly in and out are going to be imposed by the federal government. And then they're going to share administration costs, and they're going to share the administration of those policies passed out. So those TSA workers in the airport are federal workers, but they're working in a state or city-driven airport. So again, there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of intermixing between the federal state and even local governments. And so that's why cooperative federalism is always associated with this idea of a marble cake, because all of these, instead of a layer cake where it's very separate and clear and distinct, the marble cake shows you there's this intermixing of responsibilities and there's this really blurred distinction between the levels of government, because again, it's intermixed, it's shared, everyone sort of still has their own role, but if you remove one part, right, you can't just take out the chocolate in that cake. You're going to get some vanilla with it. Same idea. You can't just remove the federal government from that marble cake because then the states sort of fall apart and vice versa. The states have to be in play too. Another really great example of cooperative federalism occurred during the civil rights movement and segregation.
Governor Orville Forbes of Arkansas was a moderate by Southern standards, a man the black community had supported. But in his last election, he faced tough opponents, and he knew he'd lead the segregationist vote if he wanted to be re-elected. The night before school opened, Forbes made a decision.
I have therefore in accordance with the solemn responsibility and the oath of my office taken the following action. Units of the National Guard have been and are now being mobilized with the mission to maintain or restore the peace and good order of this community. Advanced units are already on duty on the grounds of Central High School.
The Arkansas National Guard ranged the school with orders to admit only the white students. It shocked the country. State troops were now being used to prevent enforcement of federal law. At the center of the crisis were these 9 teenagers, selected by the school board because of their excellent grades. The first day, 8 of the 9 went to school together, accompanied by their parents and ministers. They expected some harassment, but no real trouble.
You could cut it with a knife, the tension outside the school, with these people who had come in from other parts of the state, other states. There were license plates from all other states that were there. People who had come in and were outside our school.
The 8 children and the adults with them were turned away by the National Guard. ninth student, Elizabeth Eckford, had missed the call to gather with the others before school. Elizabeth Eckford walked alone and met a mob.
Can you tell me your name, please? Are you going to go to school here at Central High? You don't care anything, is that right? This girl here was the first Negro apparently of high school age. She showed up at Central High School the day that the federal court ordered it relegated. She was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at her.
Well, it has to be the most frightening thing. I mean, because she had a crowd of white people behind her threatening to kill her. She had nobody. I mean, there was not a black face in sight anywhere. Nobody that she could turn to as a friend, except that this woman came out of the crowd and guided her through the mob and onto the bus and got her home safely.
The black parents and the NAACP went back to court. The leader of the state organization, Daisy Bates, became the students' strongest supporter. The national NAACP saw this case as a showdown for desegregation, and they assisted the local lawyers.
Well, we consider this case one of the segregation cases, but in addition to the fact that this one involved the appearance of the National Guard on scene, and for the first time in any of our cases, we actually discovered that eventually will have to be brought across. Then we see it as a state-federal concept of authority.
The question was whether the federal government would assert its authority. The pressure on the president increased. Defiance of federal law seemed to be spreading. From Little Rock, here to North Little Rock, to Nashville, Tennessee, and to Charlotte, North Carolina. Some people blamed Eisenhower for this resistance, saying his lack of leadership on civil rights encouraged the extremists.
President Eisenhower's position was that he was the president of all the people. He felt that his role was to talk to the moderates throughout the country, including the southern states. He felt that, and was told by many advisors, that Governor Faubus could be reasoned with, and that an amicable solution could be found in the Little Rock crisis.
In mid-September, the president and the governor had a meeting at Eisenhower's vacation home in Newport, Rhode Island.
The president thought that he had persuaded Governor Faubus to go back and allow the black children to enter the high school peaceably. And it was quite a surprise to him. He felt right now when Governor Faubus decided against allowing the black children to enter the high school.
Eisenhower had convinced Faubus that ultimately the state could not resist federal authority. Faubus changed his tactic. He simply removed the National Guard, leaving only city police in an explosive situation as the Little Rock Mine entered Central High School.
We entered the side of the building. Thousands of people up front. And we were entering the side, and I could just get a glimpse of this group. And in the car, I could hear on the radio, I could hear that there was a mob. And I knew what a mob meant. And I knew that the sounds that came from the crowd were very angry. So we entered the side of the building very, very fast.
We just got a report here on this end that the students are attention occurring down there.
The three of us represented the black press. That was all. And we were on the mall in front of the school, and the word got to the crowd outside that the niggas are in the school. Then they said to us, you come out here as a decoy, and then other people slip them into the side of this building. So I said, hell no. Just leave.
The crowd turned on Hicks and on his companions, Moses Newsom and Alex Wilson.
Somebody had a brick in his hand, and instead of throwing the brick, because he was too close, he hit Alex Wilson up the side of his head with this brick. Of course, Wilson was more than 6 feet tall, and that's when he went down like a tree.
The mob was getting cast in wooden sawhorses because the policemen would no longer fight their own in order to protect us. And so someone made a suggestion that if they allowed the mob to hang one kid, they could then get the rest out. And a gentleman whom I believe to be an assistant chief police said, how are you going to choose your own restaurants? He said, I'll get them out. And we were taken to the basement of this place. And we were put into 2 cars, grayish blue-colored Fords. And the man instructed us, once you start driving, do not stop.
The rioting was headline news. The nation and the world saw unmistakably the face of resistance. Finally, President Eisenhower realized he had to act, and he did quickly. That night, he sent in the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division.
An extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met. And with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights. If resistance to the federal court order cease at once, the further presence of federal troops will be unnecessary. And if platform of their name high of our nation in the world will be removed. Mob rule can not be allowed to override the decisions of our courts.
So basically what you just saw right there was after Brown versus Board of Education, and that's a pretty famous law that did not allow, basically declared segregation in schools to be illegal. Schools in the South, in particular, had to begin to desegregate. Well, they didn't really love that federal law. They wanted to keep schools segregated. And so there's a perfect example where cooperative federalism, right, this is supposed to be shared here, this is supposed to be cooperative, where the states are sort of fighting back and saying to the federal government, we don't want to follow those guidelines that you've set forth. We don't want to follow this rule. So that was sort of a point where there's going to be a lot of contention between who's got the power. And what ends up happening is when President Eisenhower sent in the 101st Airborne Division, they basically escorted the kids to and from school. They walked with them to each class. They stood outside of the classroom to make sure that those kids were permitted and allowed to go to school, receive an education, fair and free education, and also not be hurt in the process. And it took that went on for about a year. So it wasn't a quick fix. It took, a while for that to kind of dissipate and go away. But the lesson learned here is that, cooperative federalism can work really, really well, and it can work really, really bad. Because at the end of the day, somebody's got to have more power, somebody's got to be in charge, and the states sort of have to rein in at times and really follow what the federal government says needs to happen. Last week we talked about fiscal federalism, and we talked about how this is sort of where federalism has headed, probably in the last 25 years, where the federal government provides grants to different state and local governments, and in doing and providing those grants, it kind of forces the states to adhere and follow certain powers. So last week we didn't get a chance to talk about the different kinds of grants, but we will today. So The first set of grants is called states and air grants and aid. Then there's a set of grants called matching grants, and then something called categorical grants. And then lastly, we'll speak about block grants. So there's like 4 different kinds of major grants that we'll talk about. So when the rise of grants has happened, basically what it's done in recent years is it's provided money from the national government to different states. So grants and aid are basically any kind of fund that is issued by Congress. So Congress basically passes a bill or a law, and it provides state and local governments a certain amount of money. Now, grants and aid are kind of broken up into several major categories. So the first one's called a categorical grant. And basically, if Congress appropriates money, you can only use it for certain or specific purposes. So for example, an example of a categorical grant could be a grant for like highway spending. You can't take that money that was given to you for highway spending and use it for something else. You can only use it for highway spending. Another example of a grant would be something called a crossover sanction. And basically what happens here is the federal government gives you money, and that money kind of influences how the state and local governments implement policy. So we talked about this last week, the idea of the drinking age. So technically speaking, the states are in charge of making their drinking age. But what the federal government does, they're sneaky. They tie the federal highway funds to the drinking age. So if states were to change the drinking age, then they would lose all of their federal highway funds. So that's a really great example of a crossover sanction because you're talking about an exorbitant amount of money. No state's going to change their drinking age. Technically speaking, they could, but they're not going to because that money is attached. That federal highway money is attached as a crossover sanction to ensuring that the drinking age stays 21. Block grants are a little bit different. They're kind of just the federal government throwing some money at you. We'll talk more about those in a second. Formula grants. They're basically money that states and local governments get, and they're calculated according to a formula. Now, obviously, each formula is different depending on what the formula grant is for. So, for example, Medicaid. Medicaid is tied to your age limit, the kinds maybe of medical services that you need, and then how much money that you make a year. So there's a certain formula. It figures out how many people within a state need Medicaid, and then the federal government basically issues that money to the state, and then the state basically distributes that money to the people who are, deserving and fulfill the requirements to get Medicaid. Your school lunch is another great example of a formula grant. They figure out basically a formula for, what parents make. So if your parents make below a certain amount, then you as a student either qualify for reduced or free lunch. They figure out how many schools are in a state, how many of those schools need that school lunch formula grant, and then the federal government distributes that money throughout the state. And then each school receives a portion of that formula grant to issue their students school lunch. Same thing with public housing. So obviously cities tend to get more formula grant money for public housing because there's a greater need for it versus like a rural or suburban area. So basically there's a formula, the money is distributed and dispensed based on who qualifies within that formula. Block grants, we just kind of spoke very briefly about those. That's basically money that's given to state and local governments, and they can do whatever the heck they want to do with it as long as they stay within a broad area. So for example, the federal government will say, here's $7 million to be used on education. How the state or local government use that $7 million is up to them. It could be for new computers, it could be to hire more teachers, it could be for teacher education programs, like professional development. It could be for equipment in the school. It could be for new textbooks. As long as it fulfills that idea of education, then the state and local governments can basically distribute and use the money for whatever they want. Block grants are the best kind of grants to get because there's not a lot of restrictions, and that's always good. Mandates, these are the things, so these are the opposite of block grants. These are the things that state and local governments sort of hate. Mandates are programs that the federal government issues, so it's basically the federal government saying, hey, you have to comply or do this thing, but you got to pay for it yourself. Sometimes the federal government will give money to cover it, but sometimes they don't. So Medicaid's a really great example. Now, they always give money to cover Medicaid, but they've in recent years expanded who qualifies and who fits in. So obviously the cost of healthcare goes up. Now more people qualify for Medicaid, but the funding doesn't always cover it. So what does the state have to do? Well, the state has to provide Medicaid for people, so they got to kick in the rest. The American Disabilities Act, there was a whole problem when this was passed in 1990. So basically what the American Disabilities Act says is that colleges, universities, public schools, public institutions have to have a way to get, to allow people to enter in and make their institutions and buildings handicap accessible. So, if you have stairs, you also have to have a ramp. If you have stairs inside of the building, you need to have an elevator, an escalator, or something. So obviously, adding all those things in costs money. And sometimes, like I said, the federal government will give you money for it, and sometimes they won't. Clean Air Act, businesses can't produce a certain amount of pollution. Well, they're not going to help you get new technologies to reduce your pollution. That's up to those individual businesses. But those businesses have to make sure that they're adhering to that act. No Child Left Behind is another example. You have to make sure your students are at a certain level before they can pass to certain grades. How do you prove that they're at that level? It's through testing. How do you make sure that they get to that level? Well, it could be through a variety of things: better teachers, better education programs, better access to technology, etc. The states require you to make sure that you do that because you have to adhere to the federal law, but the states might not always provide the funding to make sure that the kids are actually left behind and are getting to those areas that they need to be. And if you look at this, right, you look at these two diagrams right here, and you see the difference in how federal money is being spent via states from 1960 to 2001. In 1960, most of the federal money came from, income security and for transportation and highways. That's more than half. 3/4 of the money that came from federal grants to state and local governments went to transportation and highways, and then income security, which would be like the welfare system. Now, if you look at it, the diagram's completely shifted. Only 11% of money coming from federal grants goes to transportation and highways. Okay, the rest, a lot of it's spent on education, a lot of it's spent on healthcare. Still a good chunk is being spent on welfare, and then there's this whole miscellaneous category. So there's definitely been this shift in the kind of federal grant money we're getting, but then also where it's being spent. Some famous mandates that you're probably familiar with would be No Child Left Behind. The idea, right, that there's these state tests that to assess schools and to make sure that children are making adequate progress. There's been a ton of mandates after 9/11. They want to make sure that there's security in place, and the Department of Homeland Security for via transportation for a variety of things: background checks on issuing guns, background checks on allowing people to work for the federal government, all kinds of things. But who pays for that? Obviously it's the taxpayers, but a lot of those programs that had to be implemented at the state levels were required by the federal government, but the federal government didn't always pay for them. Something like a Hurricane Katrina, or in recent years, Hurricane Sandy. All these people lose their homes, they lose their property, they lose everything, and the federal government issues money to help clean it up and kind of get people back to work, business back flowing. So that's been Hurricane Katrina was sort of a screw up, and that's why kind of Hurricane Sandy was more successful. The Affordable Care Act, right now, everyone's got to have health insurance. So the states have to create these things called healthcare exchanges, which are really expensive, and they are getting some federal money, but not totally. So the rest of that, okay, is up to the states to be responsible for. So that part of fiscal federalism is, obviously, it is a bit complicated, but at the end of the day, just kind of realize that there's money set aside from the federal government, and there's all these different categories and grants and aid for how that money is distributed. So as long as you have a basic understanding of the kinds of grants that are available and what each does, you'll be okay. So we have dual federalism that ends around 1935. We have cooperative federalism that begins around 1939 and lasts up until, probably I would say the 1970s. And beginning around the 1980s was something called New Federalism. And for most of the 20th century, there was sort of this conflict between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats always want to increase the power of the federal government. Republicans always want to decrease it. And when Ronald Reagan was president in the 1980s, he really does his best to try to return power to the state levels and to sort of even the balance of strength between national and state governments. And so he's actually under his administration is when that idea of block grants kind of came to be. So there's like a lot of freedom for states on how to handle the money in a block grant. So he's sort of attributed to that idea. And along with New Federalism is this idea of something called the devolution revolution, and it's another drive to give more power back towards the states. So basically it's this transfer of responsibility. So, they get rid of federal speed limits, and that's why each state sort of has their own speed limit, even on federal highways. They're going to allow states to issue their own welfare requirements. So they're going to kind of rein the power of the federal government back in and sort of transfer it back to the states. And that begins in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And that really happens because Congress begins to be controlled in both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, by Republicans. So the devolution revolution really happens around 1994. And essentially what Congress is able to do is get rid of some federal law. And they basically say the national government doesn't have the power to make them, and the Republicans in general, under this idea of devolution revolution, really interpret the Constitution very, very strictly. They really take it extremely literal. They want to make sure that powers return to the states, and that they're not going to, during this time period, they don't pass super costly federal programs. Obviously, that's sort of shifted back a little bit more in recent years, but this has sort of been the push, returning the power to the states, and that's why you see things like gun laws, gay marriage, marijuana, immigration laws, even healthcare laws. There's been such a battle between the federal government and the states, and that's really attributed to the devolution revolution. So speaking of challenges of federalism, we're going to look at 5 major ones. So this first map right here kind of gives you gay marriage. Now this is from 2013. It shows you the states that are legally banning it, ones that have a constitutional ban, others that allow civil unions, so they allow homosexuals to marry, but they don't call it marriage. They call it a civil union instead. The states in the stripes, they're kind of pending to see, and then all of those states in the red, do permit it. So as you can see, 20 years ago, this map is completely black. Right now, it's definitely changing, it's definitely shifting, and one of these being that each state should have the power to decide versus the national government or the Constitution telling us who should. Another one, if you look at this other one, this would be like executions. This is a great example of federalism. Each state decides whether or not the death penalty is best for its state, its citizens. And as you see, there's been a shift. So if you look at 1977 versus 2007, the map looks completely different. Some states have, gotten rid of the death penalty. Some still have it, but they're not really using it. And then some states obviously remain, not using it at all. So this is kind of a good example of showing you, and it even shows you who's, the number of executions that have happened and occurred by state. Next map shows you the status of marijuana laws in the United States and where it's fully illegal, where it's considered to be medical and decriminalized. Pennsylvania's recently, or the city of Philadelphia has recently decriminalized it, where it's just decriminalized, where it's just used for medical purposes, and where it's just, where it is legalized completely for recreational use. Another really cool kind of graph to look at is this idea of No Child Left Behind. And this is actually a poll where they asked voters, who do you think should be paying for it? Who do you think is the most responsible for making sure No Child Left Behind is met by school districts? And, as you see, most people are arguing that's up for the states to decide. It's up for the state and the local governments to kind of work together and make sure that each school district is adhering to those provisions and policies. So, to sort of recap everything, obviously federalism is sort of complicated. Our government is extremely complicated. It involves, a variety of sort of intricate details. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure that you understand that there's different levels. There's ways that they sort of keep to themselves. There's ways that they sort of cooperate. There's ways that histories come into play to change the types of federalism that have existed. And then, there's a way that the people and the public opinion has sort of influenced it as well. Good luck. I would certainly recommend that you visit as many of the midterm review links and tools that I've posted, and make sure that you come into those study sessions on Tuesday and Wednesday with lots and lots of questions.